Chapter 24, View from the Ramparts. There was a girl in Norfolk, Virginia, who was suing a man for alleged rape. The judge said to her, "When did this rape occur?" "When did it occur, Judge?" said she. "Why, hell, it was rape, rape, rape all summer long." Michael Josselson. In early 1966, the CIA learned that the California-based magazine Ramparts was pursuing leads to the agency's network of front organizations. Richard Helms, Deputy Director for Plans, immediately appointed a special assistant to pull together information on Ramparts, including any evidence of subversion, and devising proposals for CIA counteraction. By May 1966, Helms was feeding the White House with the inside dope on Ramparts as part of a campaign to smear the magazine, its editors, and contributors. Much of the information supplied by Helms had been produced as the result of a trawl through agency records, with additional dirt supplied courtesy of the FBI. Point to Helms, who was convinced that Ramparts was being used as a vehicle by the Soviets, ordered a full investigation of its financing, but failed to turn up any evidence of foreign involvement. After reading through the Ramparts file, Presidential Assistant Peter Jessup penned a memo with the memorable subject line, "A right cross to the left temple." In view of Ramparts' dedication to smearing the administration and the murky background of its sponsorship, one might think that some agency of the government would be pursuing the threads involved here. A week later, the magazine Human Events ran a smear under the title, "The Inside Story of Ramparts Magazine." Its journalists were dismissed as snoops, eccentrics, ventriloquists, and bearded new leftniks who had a get-out-of-Vietnam fixation. Signed by one M.M. Morton, the pen name of an expert on internal security affairs, the article bore all the hallmarks of a CIA plant. As did a News Weekly piece of the same week, "Who Really Mans the Ramparts?" and an article in the Washington Star, both of which announced serious doubts about the bona fides of Ramparts, which was described as not only a muckraker, but a muckraker with a malevolent motive. For more than a year, the CIA did everything it could to sink Ramparts. "I had all sorts of dirty tricks to hurt their circulation and financing," Deputy Inspector General Edgar Applewhite later confessed. "The people running Ramparts were vulnerable to blackmail. We had awful things in mind, some of which we carried off. We were not the least inhibited by the fact that the CIA had no internal security role in the United States. For amazingly, given the awfulness of the CIA's intentions, Ramparts survived to tell the tale." Just as the CIA feared, Ramparts went ahead and published its investigation into CIA covert operations. The magazine's findings, published in April 1967, were swiftly picked up in national newspapers, and an orgy of disclosures followed, leading one commentator to conclude that, before very long, every political society, philanthropic trust, college fraternity, and baseball team in America will be identified as a front for the Central Intelligence Agency. It wasn't just domestic American fronts that were exposed, of course. As details of the CIA's sponsorship of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and its magazines emerged, everything O'Brien had said about Encounter appeared to be true. Spender, who was still in the States at the time the story broke, went into an instant spin. Desperate to contain him, Josselson and Lasky both appealed to Isaiah Berlin, who was known to have a moderating effect on Stephen's temperament, and who was teaching at the City University of New York at the time. "Dear Isai Mendelovich," wrote Josselson on the 8th of April, "what I wanted to discuss with you cannot very well be done over the phone. I am very seriously concerned about Stephen and Encounter ending up by being real victims of the present mess, if Stephen, like Natasha in London, keeps on pouring oil on the flames. I am genuinely fond of both of them, hence my concern, and I also know that if anyone can influence Stephen, it is you. The situation is serious indeed, but surely Encounter's future cannot be solved by making drastic moves under pressure. 6. There is indeed a problem about Stephen and Encounter, and Arthur Schlesinger, who has just informed Lasky that the issue is dead here, and there is no need to have a meeting about all this in London, is, I think, being somewhat optimistic," wrote Berlin by return. Whatever may be the reactions here, the issue is likely to go boiling on in London, since both Stephen and Kermode are said to be troubled. It seems to me that whatever the future of Encounter, There will be some sense in publishing some kind of statement telling the readers that the editors of Encounter were not aware of the sources of funds to the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which will be true of at any rate most of them. How much Lasky did or didn't know I have, of course, no means of telling. At any rate, I think you should probably recommend that a meeting of the relevant parties be held in London for the purpose of settling this issue. Transatlantic telephone calls to Stephen in Chicago, the others in London, Arthur in New York, yourself in Geneva, etc., won't be enough. You will never see the situation as a whole unless there is some kind of meeting to settle the moral, intellectual, and organizational future of Encounter. 7 in London, meanwhile, Kermode's defense of the libel action was irretrievably lost. Furthermore, he was convinced that, although the new sponsorship of Encounter under Cecil King was perfectly licit, the magazine was still in rather devious ways under the control, however delicately channeled, of the CIA. Kermode wrote to Lasky to detail his complaints and to tell him that in the absence of very persuasive explanations, I couldn't go on working with him. He didn't answer the letter, but came out to Gloucestershire to talk it over. As we walked, hour after hour, round the garden and paddock, he gave me the fullest account that could have been expected of his relation to the Congress and of the history of Encounter. This was the moment of Lasky's soi-disant confession. He admitted to Kermode that he had known of CIA support for some years now, but that he could not possibly say this publicly. Soon after, and at Isaiah Berlin's urging, an emergency meeting of the Encounter trustees was convened, attended by Lasky, Kermode, Spender, who flew back from the States, Edward Shills, Andrew Schonfield, and William Hayter. They met in a private room at Scott's Restaurant on the Haymarket, just a few yards away from the Encounter office. Shills and Schonfield defended the CIA's actions, but Kermode and Spender announced their intention to resign. Lasky refused to resign and inveighed against Spender, calling him a hypocrite. Then he dropped a bombshell. Spender should get off his high horse about CIA funding and consider this. His salary had for years been covered by a subvention from the Foreign Office. Spender became very agitated and announced that he was going off to look at some picture in the National Gallery to calm himself. Kermode remembered. By the time Spender got home to St. John's Wood, he was, said Natasha, in a shocked and angry state. Melvin had apparently said something to Stephen about his salary, which Stephen said was completely incomprehensible. Spender decided to clear the matter up once and for all by speaking to Muggeridge. Malcolm had effectively been Stephen's employer throughout all this. As it happened, he spoke to Kitty, who said Malcolm couldn't speak to him as he was in Scotland. At that very moment, Malcolm was lying flat on his face in a chancel of a Scottish Cistercian monastery being filmed at prayer for a BBC television program called A Hard Bed to Lie On. Anyway, an hour after, Malcolm called back. By this time, Stephen was absolutely fuming. I was on the other phone, so I could hear what was said. Stephen said, "Malcolm, you always told me my salary was coming from the Daily Telegraph and Alexander Korda." And Malcolm said, "So I did, dear boy, but you can't bet your bottom dollar where it really came from. You know that scene in the 39 Steps where he's looking for the man with the missing finger? There's a terrible moment when he realizes who the man is." That's the feeling we had when Muggeridge finally admitted it. 11 Eric Bentley later told Spender that Lasky, too, had been in on the secret. Mel told me there was nothing in the rumors, which I have heard for years. When things started humming a year ago, I asked him to say no point blank to a clearly worded letter. Silence. At which point my attitude is, Mel can keep his Cold War. 12, after his intemperate outburst against Spender and his huge gaffe in revealing the source of his salary, Lasky was in a very precarious position. Having secured the full backing of Cecil King, who rejected calls for his resignation, saying, "It would surely be folly for us to lose the baby with the bathwater, 13, Lasky now turned to Isaiah Berlin, writing him an oily letter on the 13th of April. He hoped he was not burdening him, Lasky said, "but you have been so much part of our history, our splendors and, alas, our miseries, that I feel you ought to be kept completely informed." 14, Lasky said that it had been agreed that we should end the story by issuing a dignified statement and also by settling the O'Brien affair, simply and quickly, if possible, on the basis of costs to O'Brien and the publication of the 10 lines of apology he wants. Why not? Emotions may rebel, but reason dictates. Lasky ended by asking the great philosopher to drop me a word with your thoughts and advice. As you know, they mean much and deeply to me. 15. These were fulsome words for a man revered by many as the prophet, but whom Lasky privately scorned as a mugwump and a fence-sitter. 16. The trouble with Berlin, said Lasky, was that he wasn't a crusader. There are some crusaders with temperament who say devil take the hindmost, and there are those who are prudent. In the heat of the campaign, you feel let down. You want to say, like Henry IV, where were you? 17. But Berlin had always been there. The wise man to whom the Washington elite had turned all those years ago when it first came up with the idea of embracing the non-communist left. Could he have managed not to know about the CIA's involvement in this? Anecdotal evidence suggests he was aware, though not actually willing to take an active part. Stuart Hampshire recalled that Berlin was repeatedly approached by members of the intelligence community. They were constantly making overtures to Berlin to be more involved. I remember they once approached him at Aspen, Colorado. That was CIA all over, they ran it, because they thought he was the ideal liberal to head up some organization or other. And he said he wasn't interested, but he suggested somebody else. 18, another story has it that Berlin was once asked by one of the largest American foundations, which wanted to cut a swathe in philosophy. What can we do to help you? Pragmatism made a great contribution, but now is passé. How about existentialism? Berlin had a momentary vision of subsidized CIA cafes in Paris, but replied that the only things he wanted were paper, a pen, and the occasional discussion. 19, in his letter to Berlin, Lasky enclosed the text of the editorial statement which had been drafted by the trustees, and which was due to be printed in the next issue of Encounter. In view of recent newspaper reports concerning the employment of CIA funds by some U.S. foundations to support cultural and educational organizations, we wish to make the following statement, it read. We are distressed by the news that so much of worldwide American philanthropy from U.S. foundations should have been based on indirect and covert governmental subventions. This practice was unwise, unsound, and deplorable. We find it painful to learn that some of the grants which, in the past, came to us from the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Paris, and which we accepted in good faith, should have derived from such funds, whose real sources were so obscured. The leading writers and scholars who have been responsibly associated with the Congress in Paris have made it clear that there was never any interference in their policies or activities by any donor, known or unknown. Encounter, in its turn, has from the outset been independent and entirely free from any form of interference. The editors alone have always been solely responsible for what they published, and the Congress never, in any way, or any occasion, had any say in editorial policy. Encounter continues to exercise its freedom to publish what it pleases. 20. The statement was never published, 21. Berlin, who at this point had no knowledge of Lasky's collusion in the secret behind Encounter, as confessed days before to Kermode, answered Lasky's letter on the 18th of April. He approved of the decision to settle with O'Brien out of court, and then, with great pragmatism, schadenfreude even, signposted the way out of the complicated web. You could perfectly well say that, like other organizations in need of financial assistance, you went to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. They went to other foundations of a prima facie respectable kind. That recipient bodies are not in the habit of examining the sources of income of the prima facie respectable bodies which support them, but that since these revelations there is natural embarrassment and reluctance about accepting such sums. This is more or less what the Asia Foundation, another CIA front, said, and it seems to me adequate. The proper role of Encounter is simply to say that they acted as they did in ignorance, and that now that you have been made an honest journal of the fact that you received grants indirectly from the CIA, merely places you on an equality with a great many other organizations who could not possibly have been expected to know what the ultimate sources of their funds were, or something of that kind. Men of sense and goodwill will understand this, Those who lack it will continue to snipe anyway. 22. If Berlin felt any moral repulsion at the complex deception he was here describing, he didn't show it. Rather, he borrowed from the rhetoric of the open society to defend what in reality was the attempted management of that society by a closed shop. Publicly, however, Isaiah Berlin was soon to take a different tack. When the story of Encounter's relationship with the CIA emerged, he spurned the magazine and attacked Josselson and Lasky for having compromised decent people. His biographer, Michael Ignatieff, asserts that Berlin was as shocked as anybody by this surreptitious relationship, and that he certainly had no official or unofficial relationship with either British intelligence or the CIA. 23. Ridiculing this claim, Christopher Hitchens, reviewing Ignatieff's book, has written that the Encounter disavowal, taken literally, would mean that Berlin was abnormally incurious, or duller than we have been led to suppose, or had wasted his time in Washington. Berlin's double stand on the whole issue emanated from his allegiance to the Anglo-American supranational understanding, which, says Hitchens, frequently bore the stamp of realpolitik and, well, calculation. 24. The trustees meeting at Scott's restaurant, having resolved nothing, a second emergency conference was called for the weekend of 21st of April, for which Arthur Schlesinger now flew in from New York. According to Natasha Spender, it was decided at this meeting that Lasky should resign, and he agreed to do so. This would be announced in a statement of the trustees to be published in Encounter. Lasky had opened by making a terrific personal attack on Stephen, saying that he must have known what was going on. All the other trustees told Lasky that this was totally out of order and should be struck from the record. 25, Natasha recalled. Edward Shills said he would find a position for Lasky in Chicago, and the next week, Shills flew back with that aim in view. But the day after the meeting, Lasky had changed his mind, saying he had no intention of resigning, and he wasn't going to agree to the statement at all. A few days before this meeting, Natasha took a telephone call from Michael Josselson in Geneva. And he told me not to rock the boat, and he went on and on about how he was trying to protect Stephen. And I think I said, "Whose boat? I don't think Stephen and Frank are in the same boat as Mel." 26. Having failed to calm either Natasha or Stephen by telephone, Josselson now tried a different tactic. In an attempt to remove them both from the fray, he hinted to Junkie Fleischman that maybe the Spenders needed a holiday. But it didn't wash. I was absolutely furious with Junkie when, on top of everything that was going on, he sent us a telegram saying, would we like to spend a week on his yacht, fumed Natasha Spender. We sent him a stinker back, and that was that. We never saw him again. 27. The Junkie proposal came to nothing, so Josselson now wrote directly to Stephen. First, he said that Lasky's comments at the trustees' meeting about the Foreign Office subvention had been misinterpreted, the result of a confusion, and that he had only been referring to a rumor which had disturbed him deeply. I was afraid that if Mel was sufficiently nettled, he would do just what he finally did at the trustees' meeting. I had tried to prevent this as best I could, and hence my plea to you and to Natasha not to rock the boat too much, and my assurance that I was only trying to protect everybody. I got particularly alarmed after I heard from Brigitte Lasky that Natasha had snubbed her at a recent party. Josselson went on to say that Natasha Spender had been publicly and bitterly critical of Lasky. In view of what she's been through, I forgive Natasha everything, wrote Josselson. But this conversation with her convinced me that it was not only a matter of her disliking Mel, but of her hating him. Excuse the harsh word, pathologically. 28. Josselson went on to apologize for Lasky's outburst against Spender. Mel has since told me how much he regrets having let himself get carried away, and implored Spender not to resign. I still believe that Encounter is a truly magnificent achievement, and I would hate to see it go under, and go under ignominiously, if the three of you, because obviously Mel would also resign, cannot view what has happened more dispassionately, more philosophically. 29. Josselson offered a palliative. He hinted heavily that Lasky was due for a career change. I think he should look for a situation in the academic world, and that the 10th anniversary of his editorship of Encounter, due in 1968, would be psychologically a good time for him to leave. Josselson also revealed that he had experienced recurring moments of despair over the whole affair, but that this was given a perspective by a much greater problem, that of remaining an American citizen in the face of the war in Vietnam. Finally, he said he had had no ulterior motives for keeping the funding secret. I was in a position to help hundreds of people all over the world do what they themselves wanted to do, whether it was to write books, paint pictures, pursue certain studies, travel when and where they wanted to go, or edit magazines. All this I enjoyed doing, and if you think the CIA got anything out of it, believe me, the shoe was on the other foot. 30. On the 8th of May, 1967, the New York Times ran a front-page story under the headline, "Steven Spender Quits Encounter." Spender was quoted as saying he had heard rumors for several years that the magazine was being supported by CIA funds, but I was never able to confirm anything until a month ago. In view of the revelations that have been made and allegations which may still be made about past sources of encounter funds, I feel that any editor who was knowingly or unknowingly involved in receiving these should resign. I have done so. 31. So did Kermode, which left only Lasky at the helm. And there he clung, despite calls for his resignation and to the consternation of Josselson, who knew the game was up. Later that afternoon, a statement was issued by Cecil King. We consider that Encounter without Mr. Lasky would be as interesting as Hamlet without the prince. When the whole thing blew, I was in Portofino with Isaiah and other friends, Stuart Hampshire recalled. I remember that 6 of us cabled in defense of Stephen in London, but Mary McCarthy refused to sign, saying, "Oh, you're just turning on our little New York boy." Stephen was very upset, and Natasha even more so, and particularly with Lasky. But why were they surprised at his behavior? Did they really expect him to resign? I mean, that's not what he would have done. Of course not. 32, writing to Spender some days later, Muggeridge said that he found it monstrous that in spite of everything, Mel should remain in the chair. 33. Some days after Spender's resignation, Natasha, accompanied by a friend, went to collect his belongings from the Encounter office. To her horror, she found that Stephen's locked cupboard had been broken into, and Lasky's secretary said, "Oh well, we had a burglary here last week." 34, Stuart Hampshire, who had begged Spender to keep a record of everything, to maintain a personal archive, was not surprised when he later learned of this. It was, he said, obvious. 35,